Hello and welcome to the Good Society Forum. My name is Emma Skye and I'm Director of Yale World Fellows and co-host of the Good Society Forum, which is a community of change makers around the world with a common quest to build the good society. My co-host is Nizamuddin of the Prince's Trust and a 2019 Yale World Fellow. Niz.
Thank you, Emma, and hello everybody, and you are very welcome to our Good Society Forum webinar. You, by virtue of joining, have become part of our community. That's all it takes. And we are a community, as Emma has said, that seeks to build the good society, to uplift ourselves in terms of knowledge and awareness of the different ways in which we can do that. We do have an online community, which we would love for you to be a part of in terms of following us on social media. We're on Twitter at Good Soc Forum. We're on LinkedIn. We are on Facebook. We would love for you to share your learnings, your experiences of today on social media, in particular on Twitter, using the hashtag Good Society. There will be on our chat function, which you can see, we have access and links to all of those. If you also have ideas for Good Society Forum sessions or wish to be a panelist, please do contact us. In our last two newsletters, we did ask our community to contact us for ideas, for profiles of work that you're doing so that we can spotlight the work that you're doing. And we would love for you to hear from you. The email to use is info@goodsocietyforum.com. So the plan for today is to hear from our four speakers on our theme and then take your questions. But please feel free to use the chat function as and when we go through the webinar. We're very keen for you to participate. In anticipation of that, we would love to know where you are all tuning in from. So if you can use the chat function and I think we've seen people starting doing this as we do with all of our webinars. If you could start sharing, what's your name? Where are you dialing in from? What city are you in? We'd love to know. So we have Azim from Kyrgyzstan. Thank you, Azim. You're very welcome as always. Dr. Etim from Nigeria. We have Maria from Macedonia. We have Dean from New Haven. We have Dean from New Rochelle in New York. We have Michelle from Brussels. Thank you so much. We have Norma in Hamden. We have Hi Tom from the Div School in New Haven. Yuval from Tel Aviv. Emily from California. Zoe from London. Ping from Grand Rapids in Michigan. As ever, we're delighted to have Farah from London. As ever, a really global audience filled with practitioners. Thank you all so much for joining. Emma, what's our topic for today?
So, online platforms enable people to express opinions. But they have created spaces that not only encourage the pursuit of truth and respect for democratic values, but also that enable the proliferation of hate speech. And while hate speech is undesirable in a good society, dealing with it is not an easy task if we believe that a good society values freedom of speech. Hate can be used to intimidate and prevent free speech, but policies to remove hate speech can also curb free speech. So today we're going to be discussing the problem of online hate speech. Are there limits to free speech? What responsibilities do social media platforms have in protecting free speech and other human rights of their users? How should governments, internet platforms, and society address the issue in a way that ensures the remedy is not worse than the problem?
Thank you, Emma. And today I am really thrilled to be welcoming our first speaker, who is Jason Stanley. He is a Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. Before coming to Yale in 2013, Jason was a distinguished professor in the Department of Philosophy at Rutgers University. He is the author of many books, including Know-How, Languages in Context, Knowledge, and Practical Interest, which won the American Philosophical Association Book Prize. He is the author of How Propaganda Works, an incredible book, which won the Prose Award for Philosophy from the Association of American Publishers. And his most recent book is How Fascism Works, just behind me, if you are interested in reading. It's a very, very good book. Jason writes about authoritarianism, propaganda, free speech, mass incarceration, and features in all the major publications you would expect him to, including, we've just heard, with Christian Amanpour on CNN just before he joined us. And if that's not enough, he's brilliant on Twitter. So please do follow him. Jason, really looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Niz. And of course, this topic is central right now because it looks like all over the world, WhatsApp, Twitter, Facebook, they are posing both unique, they are both helping democracy by allowing us to spread information, but also posing unique threats to democracy in ways that we don't quite understand or master. As a child of Holocaust survivors, I have to say I'm best at laying out the problem and probably not as good at solving the problem, but that's why we have so many practitioners here. So in propaganda studies, there's a famous book by Noam Chomsky and co-author called Manufacturing Consent. And it's about how newspapers and the media work together to manufacture a worldview that then is shared by everyone. I think we have something with social media that is somewhat different than this. Social media doesn't as much manufacture consent as much as it manufactures dissent. It creates a mechanism that splits us apart, cleaves society, creates masses of outrage, and this outrage can be marshaled on behalf of authoritarian leaders, and it can be marshaled on behalf of democracy movements, as in Hong Kong, for example. So this sort of novel outrage creator, where you can post some kind of content, a video or a clip or a quote, can create a massive amount of outrage, and it can be directed either for democratic good or for democratic evil. And the question, and it entirely sort of alters our conception of the power relations of speech, because traditionally we think of speech directed by the powerful against the powerless as particularly dangerous and incendiary and threatening. But if masses of powerless people on the internet can gang together and direct their outrage against you, that can be as damaging as being denounced from on high. So we have this mechanism that enables us to spread conspiracy theories very quickly, as well as spread truths very quickly. And it enables us, and the sort of platform itself incentivizes outrage. And that incentivization of outrage is a democratic problem, because you're not supposed to, in a democracy, your opponent is not someone you're supposed to be outraged with, or someone you're supposed to sit down and compromise with. So and outrage keeps people on the platform, and outrage feeds anti-democratic movements, because, for example, fascism or authoritarian movements that involve a one-party system represent any legitimate opposition as a fundamental threat, as fundamental enemies. And so, social media feeds that inclination to treat your opponent with outrage. And then that keeps you on the medium. It's one of the mechanisms by which someone might retain their job at Facebook, because they can keep someone on for a longer period of time. So to me, that's the problem, that we have these outrage creating mechanisms that can very quickly, rapidly build up masses of outrage. This outrage is neutral. It can be used for good or for ill. So the outrage itself is not necessarily the problem. but there seems to be no way to stand down from the outrage on social media. So I think when we look at solutions to this, we've got this mechanism that enables us to create social movements for good or for ill, and we have to figure out how to diffuse that, that outrage when it's necessary to do so.
Jason, thank you very much for those really thought-provoking comments. And we're going to go now to our second speaker, who is Priscilla Ruiz, the legal coordinator for the Digital Rights Program of Article 19's Mexico and Central America Office. Now, Article 19 is an international human rights organization with the mandate and focus on the defense and promotion of freedom of expression and freedom of information worldwide. Priscilla has also worked as a researcher and consultant for Amnesty International and is a frequent contributor on publications and talks on digital rights, addressing issues such as the dissemination of sexual images online without consent, the digital gap of indigenous communities in Mexico, network neutrality, and the implementation of public policies on gender violence online. Priscilla, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Emma, for the invitation, and thank you all the audience that are being here. Well, I just want to share with you the work that we've been doing in the regional office for Mexico and Central America, especially the digital rights program related to hate speech in social media and internet platforms. And also share with you how the government has been responding to this issue by promoting laws or initiatives that really inhibit freedom of expression and can also affect other human rights. It is important to highlight that freedom of expression is not absolute, but it is essential for fostering a tolerant, pluralistic, and diverse democracy society. And even though there is no uniform definition for hate speech under international human rights law, it's a broad concept which captures a wide range of expression. Everything can be hate speech from an individual perspective and interpretation because it can impact our image, our emotions, our identity, our history, among others. But what does the social media, the internet platforms, and even the government understands by hate speech? There is no unique concept with all the actors I've been mentioned before that understand and give a quite unique concept forms on their policy, on their community norms, or even under law. Each concept is built by their own understandings, by their interest, their beliefs, their political position, and even built by their own emotions. But even if a unique concept exists, the eradication of hate speech as a public problem has not been efficiently and effectively addressed through the public policy making. We know that hate speech is even more serious for democracy, but it not only generates self-censorship of people against whom it is addressed, but it affects the integrity, the freedom, and sometimes the life of the people, being liable to materialize in physical aggressions. This is a reason why the international community has prohibited it. On the other hand, there is an element of incitement that needs to be observed in hate speech. When the expression transits from discrimination to violence against a person or a group of people, and it is important to distinguish from hate speech and anything else. It is also important to address that there are only certain types of speeches that are excluded from the scope protection of rights of freedom of expression, such as propaganda of war, the apology to hatred that constitutes incitement to violence, also direct and public incitement to genocide, and also child pornography. So it is necessary to distinguish hate speech, discrimination, or incitement to violence from offensive, shocking, or disgraceful speeches. Offensive speeches that provoke anger, annoyance, and indignation, but also incite to violence and are protected by international law, related to freedom of expression as it is expressed in Article 13 of the American Convention of Human Rights, which not only protects harmless or indifferent expressions, but also those that offend, shock, disturb, are ungrateful, or disturb the state or any sector of the population, understanding that they are necessary for a democratic, open, pluralistic, and tolerant society. Internet intermediaries, which include web host companies, internet service providers, search engines, and social media platforms, play a crucial role in enabling people to access information via internet. Nowadays, the internet intermediaries involve in direct intervention over content moderation, where it involves not only the direct intervention of state regulation, but also their own community standards. Not also to mention that the terms and conditions, community standards, or the guidelines vary in the types of expression that they limit, which include prohibitions of hate speech. But we also face that the internet intermediaries have no limited transparency policy and data around moderation process. They have a lack of accountability and a limited availability of internal mechanism for appealing a moderation decision. In matters of the government bills related to hate speech, we have recently been seeing this bill in Congress in Mexico, which criminalizes any person who reproduces hate speech, hostility, discriminations, and violence against people or a group of people. And from Article 19, we have observed these problems on this bill. One is that it typifies the behaviors in a broad and in an impressive way. For example, where there is no definition on each of the conduct, and the writing is very broad by saying that there is this encouragement or promotion and incitement of hatred, hostility, discrimination against people or group of people that belong to a suspicious category, whatever that means, whatever that suspicious category means. And second of all, it criminalizes media, administrations, and platform users, or any person who, without being the sender of the offending message, makes it accessible either way. So from Article 19, we have seen bills or this kind of initiatives that have different kinds of concepts on hate speech, but there's a lack of analysis on the regional context. The impact that may cause on freedom of expression has not been seen, but not only in freedom of expression, but also in other kinds of human rights. For example, the digital protests that many people are been doing lately with the pandemic. There is neither an analysis of this proportionality test, which sees the necessity, the legitimacy, and the proportion of it. So we are looking forward for the questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Priscilla, thank you so much for the sharing the work that you have been doing. And up next, I am delighted to invite Imran Ahmed, founder and CEO of the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which earlier this month released a fascinating report into the anti-vax industry. It's definitely worth a read. Imran regularly appears in the media as an expert in online malignant behavior, including on issues relating to misinformation, fake news, trolling, among others. Imran is a trustee of the charity Victim Support and was appointed to the steering committee of the UK government's Commission on Countering Extremism pilot task force earlier this year. Imran, so glad to have you here and looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to join, and thank you to the other panelists for really interesting perspectives. The Center for Countering Digital Hate is a new type of organization operating in this space, in that we are very much a disruption activist organization that seeks to identify the architecture through which identity-based hate and misinformation more generally. At the moment, we've got a specific focus on coronavirus misinformation, but we have looked at climate change misinformation in the past. And we seek to work out how it's being spread, why digital platforms have been uniquely effective for the spread of this kind of misinformation and hate, and then find practical ways to stop that hate from being spread. So there are two elements, I think, which perhaps add some value beyond the analysis that's already been offered. And I mean, what we won't do at the CCI, we'd be happy to do in different settings, but I won't expound too much on the definitions of hatred or how international bodies might try to find solutions on hatred which are acceptable to the plurality, the heterogeneous sort of array of actors that have a perspective on hate. Our perspective is really simple in that we see hate and misinformation in the same way that, I think it was a famous Supreme Court justice who was asked about pornography, and he said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And because so much of what, of the modern proselytization of hate and misinformation is coded, is meant to be read exegetically, is done in a sly and underhand way, that one of the things that the CCDH does is point the finger and go, yeah, we know what you're doing. You can be cute if you want, but we do know what you're doing. And so when it comes to the shaping of the information environment using the tools of digital platforms to make people believe, for example, that Muslims pose a particular threat to young women, or that people from Mexico are a threat to civil order, or that young black males pose a particular threat to a law and order threat. We cut through that in many respects by exposing the content and letting other people decide. And I'll explain how in a moment. So the two things that I think I'd like to add that I think are salient, given that we are talking to an extent about digital platforms, is that digital platforms advantage the spread of misinformation and hate. And a lot of the time we talk about the tension between free speech and hate speech. But actually on these platforms, there is no equality of arms. And that's because these platforms are oriented around engagement. So what wins in the economy so the attention economy that's inbuilt to these platforms is directed around what gathers the most engagement, rather than the factualness, whether or not something is particularly popular in a public level. It's designed to reward that which is controversial, because the platforms are not designed to be good for speech or for debate or for public policy outcomes. They're designed to be good for keeping you on that platform, scrolling down as continuously so that ads can be contextually served to you as you go along. And what keeps you engaged? Of course, it's controversial content. And why is that true? Because we have a desire as human beings to respond to things that we find offensive. Whether you want to call that virtue signaling, which we know confers a benefit in society. So within your in-group, if you express yourself through virtue signaling, through saying, I disagree with something, you actually signal to your own group that you are with them. Or it's because we find it morally offensive, it offends our values. And we know that psychologically that can quite often be just as bad, just as painful as being physically assaulted, that we find that an offense upon ourselves, and it induces a psychological fight or flight reaction that we want to combat. And of course, countering online is much easier than countering in real life. So the algorithms are looking out constantly for content that does that and then seeking to promote it. Because of course, these platforms don't provide an open, free flow of ideas. Those ideas are sorted. We don't have a timeline anymore. We have an algorithmically generated, curated list of content that has the highest likelihood of keeping us hooked on and scrolling again. And so in that respect, part of our job is to say to those platforms, we know what you're doing. We know that controversy sells. that hate sells, that misinformation is more engaging than fact. If I said to you now that I'm looking out of my window and the sky is blue, you'd go, meh. If I said to you right now that the sky is green, you'd start asking questions. Well, is there a filter in your window? Are you colorblind? Perhaps there's a pollution spill. Is there something in the air? What time is it there? And if that's the dynamic that precisely these platforms rely upon to keep you engaged. So we don't believe that this free speech argument is necessarily as clear cut in terms of there being a free speech, that these platforms do not offer a free speech platform anyway. And that is by nature of their design. And it's not just the algorithmic design, it's their fundamental business model design. So that's the one point. The second point that I'd like to raise is this question of, well, who responds? So who decides what is hate? At the moment, we talk a lot about governments deciding, criminalizing speech, and I'm squeamish about that because I'm a liberal. What CCDH seeks to do is say that actors beyond the government have an ability to influence what sort of debate is held online. And as the founder of Stop Funding Fake News, which persuades advertisers not to put adverts on fake news sites or misinformation sites that carry hate and misinformation, but also as working in solidarity with our colleagues from Stop Hate for Profit, which is being run by Colour of Change, ADL and others in the States, we say, well, actually advertisers have a particular power. So we seek to influence all aspects of civil society, not necessarily the state itself, in engaging in that debate and having a much richer array of perspectives on what should be acceptable and what shouldn't.
Imran, thank you very much for those comments. So our final speaker is Murtaza Sheikh, who is co-director of the think tank Averroes and author of the forthcoming publication on incitement to religious hatred and Islamophobia under UK and international law. His insights on hate speech laws and regulation of social media companies have been relied on by the Home Affairs Committee, the late Joe Cox MP, UN committees, the Law Commission, and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Murtaza, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. The panelists have provided a lot of food for thought, and yeah, it's very interesting what Jason said about how the algorithm favors controversy. What Priscilla said about the sort of the dividing line between inciting violence or violent speech and incitement to hatred and offensive speech, and what Imran said about coordinated misinformation. Just to put those things together as a starting point for my thoughts, I would say, yes, from the beginning of when social media platforms began to now, based on those principles of causing controversy, causing debate, driving traffic through their platforms, and thus also exposing their users to advertising, which is Facebook's single largest revenue stream, it has created somewhat of a monster, which even they would not have been able to predict. And the reason I say this is because I take a slightly more glass half full, half empty, me seeing it as half full, that we actually stand at a real turning point potentially in the whole evolution of social media, democratic speech, free speech, globally really. Because what social media companies have done is they have connected the whole world in a way that the whole world wasn't connected before. And based on what's happened recently in relation to George Floyd, and especially in relation to the spread of COVID-19, is they've had an opportunity, COVID-19 especially, they've had the opportunity to show that they are not these money-hungry traffic, traffic driving platforms who only care about commercial interests. They've had the opportunity to show that actually they care about more, that they have a responsibility in the world, and they have taken unprecedented steps, especially in relation to public health and COVID-19, to work with governments, with the WHO and with international organizations to try to stem the flood of misinformation that was actually ongoing during COVID-19, and disinformation by individuals and on an organized basis. So when it comes to regulating hate speech on platforms. There are these two main aspects we need to look at. The first aspect is the technological aspect, algorithms, how hate speech is detected, how it's enforced, how long it can stay on the platform before it's taken off. Is it proactive searching, or is it people flagging content? And the other half of it is the ethics of it. What is hate speech? What should the principles be? What should the rules be? So I'll try to focus on the ethics of it and defining what this issue is and the values that it should abide by. Because they're two distinct elements that we need to look at. Now, clearly, social media companies have struggled to define hate speech. And I would say for some time, they've defined it in a creative way to try to allow as much speech as possible, regardless of if it causes harm or if it's hate speech. For example, in 2016, when I gave evidence to the Home Affairs Committee, at that point, Twitter and YouTube had untenable values and definition in their community standards. For example, Twitter would not consider anything hate speech unless it threatened violence against an individual that was named. And YouTube had a similar policy where violence had to be part of the hate speech. And that is not an honest interpretation of what hate speech is, because incitement to violence and violent threats fall under different categories of prohibited speech. Currently, and I'd like to just use as a case study the community standards of Facebook. They've come a long way, and they've also set up the oversight board recently to try to ensure that decisions about their own standards and rulings on removals can be judged in an independent way. But even with the standards as they are now, updated, there are still questions about whether they're sufficient and whether they do the job they should. For example, they define hate speech in their community standards as a direct attack on anyone who has protected characteristics such as gender, religion, and so on. The problem with this is, what do they mean by direct? Under international human rights law, there is no such distinction as direct or indirect. So it's not very clear. They don't provide explanation for what direct means. The other issue is that the protected characteristics are not the same as what international human rights law provides, which are quite extensive. For example, they don't include discrimination on the basis of linguistic identity. They do include immigration status, but it's a partial exemption, because they say that you should be able to criticize immigration policy, but not immigrants. But that, once again, is not clearly laid out. And the biggest problem with the community standards, and it's something that David Kay, the outgoing UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, has pointed out in his key reports of 2018 and 2019, is that they lack the quality of legality. They're not laws, but they do need to have the quality of legality, meaning that anyone who looks at the rules should be able to tell what they say will be considered hate speech or will not be considered hate speech. And right now, if you look at them, they're not clear at all. And the biggest problem posed, especially in the context of President Trump's statements after the unfortunate death or murder of George Floyd, was this exemption of newsworthiness and public interest. You cannot have community standards and a definition of hate speech that you try to implement, but you have a wide discretion to exempt anything that you consider to be newsworthy, which they interpreted as political actors or politicians. So anytime President Trump or any other prominent political actor violates their community standards with something that they consider hate speech, which they would normally remove, they allow it on the basis of newsworthiness. And we saw the repercussions of that globally, the boycott by the advertising companies and the reaction of Facebook in basically changing the community standards in response.
Murtaza, thank you so much for that. I am just going to quickly invite back our panelists and continue to encourage our attendees to send in your questions. We've got an incredible array of experts with us who come at this from different contexts, from different disciplines, and from different practices. And that is what is making this conversation so rich. Hopefully Imran is still there and can join us. Fantastic. So I mean, my first question, I want to ask a very open question, which is something which I think about all the time. When you compare behavior, let's say hate speech, in terms of what people are willing to do online versus that same individual, would they be engaging in the same behavior offline in real, face to face? And often the answer is no. And from your perspective, from your discipline, I would like to understand why you think that's the case. Can I start with Jason? You're on mute, Jason.
Oops, sorry.
And you're on mute again, Jason.
Sorry about that.
There you go.
So that's a great question. Timothy Snyder has a piece about this just published in the last few months. We talked about it in our language and power class. There seems to be something about confronting a person who's embodied, who's actually physically present. We've all had that changes your reaction to them. We've all had the experience of being attacked by someone on Twitter or Facebook and then meeting them in person, and they're incredibly nice and totally different. There seems to be something very different about confronting an embodied person. And we don't understand this. I'm sure we need to break this down, but you cannot talk to a person you're meeting who has a body and you shake their hand, or I guess now you touch their elbow, and respond to them in the kinds of ways, or speak and engage with them in the kinds of ways that you do on social media. And it suggests that it suggests that the old idea in political philosophy of having a deliberative body, of actually having democracy where you bring people together in a room and different citizens groups, is the way to do it.
Jason, thank you. And Imran, if I can come to you, because I know you mentioned how platforms specifically are designed to agitate and are incentivized to do so. From your perspective, why is it, I think, in terms of that offline online behavior, what causes that discrepancy? And you're on mute as well, Imran.
So there's quite a lot of psychological work, research on this, and I found it all a bit stultifying, really. And essentially, we've created two sets of norms. We've created them. Norms are created by consequences. So you could go online and call me a racial swear word, and you'd probably get away with it. You do it, I mean, one of the things I do when people are asking me about these two sets of norms, I invite them to call me I invite them to call me a racial swear word. Go on, do it on a Zoom call. Let's see how long your career lasts. And it won't. We all know there are consequences for that kind of speech. We've allowed for the creation of these sets of norms. We can decide not to have those norms. So when we talk to the Premier League, for example, this is one of the big projects that we're working on. It's called Socializing Social Media. How do you create a new set of norms? How do you stop the social mores being changed? We're actually re-socializing the offline world with the online world. That's what's happening with people like Trump and other sort of political actors who are taking their lead from the social norms that we're creating online because of the lack of consequences. So we said, when it comes to the Premier League, there was this big spate. I'm from Old Trafford in Manchester, so I'm a big Man United fan. At the start of the season, Marcus Rashford, our star striker, was being called the N-word online. And people were they were pontificating, they go, what do we do about this? Well, why don't we just do to the people that do it exactly what you would do if they did it in the stadium, ban them for life from entering the stadium. And people went, oh, that's a brilliant idea. Well, why wouldn't you do that, for crying out loud? If someone's got their season ticket in their actual profile for another team, and they fail, and they're calling Marcus Rashford the N-word, treat them as you would if they were in the stadium. And we can, as society, decide that we want to treat behavior online as we do offline. We can re-normalize, we can re-socialize social media, should we choose to do so. The reason why social media is such a cesspit is because we've decided to let it be a cesspit.
Imran, thank you. Priscilla, I'm going to come to you next. I know Jason has, he put his hand up and has a response. So small point, Jason, and you're on mute. Go for it.
Just quick point, John Stuart Mill in chapter 2 of On Liberty says, free speech will only works because we in Britain have these social norms to punish those who those in power who speak badly to those not in power. Without those social norms, of course, everything would go to pot.
Thank you, Jason. And I had the honor of auditing that class and know where that particular line of thinking goes. Priscilla, I would love to hear your thoughts on this offline-online behavior in the context of your work.
Yes, well, we have seen, especially like for journalists, there is a risk because many of their content or what they publish, it can be taken as hate speech. So what governments or any kind of actors can do is make a denounce or something against them. They can put their lives on risk. And also what we have seen is that that there is not a unique concept with the internet platforms, and that's what we are always discussing with Facebook and also with Twitter to also have this like, or to be guided by these international standards on human rights and to take them into consideration, also to have a better transparency on what kind of algorithms they're using it, because we don't have that information either. We don't have any data about how content moderation is being done. What is the criteria that these moderators are doing? Because maybe these moderators don't know what is the context in Latin America or even in Mexico or Northern Central America. They don't know about that, no?
Priscilla,
so
can I ask you, Tom has a question here, which is exactly on criteria. So it would be, I mean, it'd be amazing if you could maybe start answering what are the criteria we should use in discerning where to draw the line and limit free speech.
Yeah, but basically, one of the criteria that these platforms should have is the international human rights standards. That's what we have been trying to say to all these platforms to use them, because they have different criteria, they have different definitions and concepts, and also, second of all, they need to know the regional context of each one, because it is different if I call something in Mexico and probably in the US that is hate speech, but not in Mexico, or maybe it is something different in Central America. Also, it is important to see that there has been this international jurisprudence in cases basically in freedom of expression that need to be taken into consideration. I don't know how this like oversight board is going to work, especially because we have like this great people and elite people in the oversight board, and we don't know what kind of criteria they are willing to take into consideration, especially also in the cases. So I think, and also another recommendation is that they try to standardize their concepts on hate speech, and try to also to reach up with NGOs or other collectives that are working in this topic, because it is important also to not only protect freedom of expression and access to information, but also other human rights that are linked with it.
Thank you so much. And you mentioned the oversight board, and that's a really good segue into Murtaza, who's, you know, I'll champion your work, Murtaza. He's written a really good article on LinkedIn about the oversight board. But if you could potentially maybe speak to what Priscilla has just said about the oversight board and the difficulties of managing so many different fragments, whether it's, I think you mentioned languages in your article, and talk about the different criteria in discerning between what is free speech and what isn't.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to do that very quickly. It's quite a lot to cover, but I've been following the oversight board for quite some time, and it's you know, since the ideas have been thrown, you know, have been discussed by Facebook, and I would say the process they followed has been quite sound. They did a 1.5-year consultation with many events around the world on how it should transpire and how it should look, and I would say as it is about to begin functioning very soon, its future and its success hinges not just on its independence, but its reliance, as Priscilla said, number one, on international human rights standards, but also to be able to take account of the linguistic and the cultural diversity and context of where that speech occurs. But just like international human rights law, we can come up with overarching principles. Their application will differ to different regions, and we will have to speak to local populations and local experts and local people to understand what those words mean. Now, the second point in relation to where do we draw the line? Well, when the social media companies have come in for this criticism of, you're not dealing with hate speech, you're causing these problems in society, they've said, okay, fine, you're right. But they've been lost as to know what should be the definition of hate speech. And if you do look, if you look cumulatively at the international standards that there are there, you will find that the common theme throughout them is that we're looking to protect speech, which can be incitement to discrimination, hostility, and violence, as found in Article 20, Part 2 of the International Convention of Civil and Political Rights. And the main element of this is directed at protected characteristics. So my own understanding, interpretation, which I've shared with many policymakers, is that the differentiating factor between speech that offends and speech that's incitement to hatred is when it is directed at someone's identity. When we are talking about ideas, when we're talking about religions, when we're talking about philosophies, then it's fine. It's open season. We might not like what's said, but it should be permitted, because that is within the bound of democratic debate. And the last point I'd just like to make is that if you look at all the international standards, you will find that there's a hierarchy of what is and what isn't hate speech, because hate speech itself is not a legal term. Incitement to hatred is, incitement to violence is, incitement to hostility is, incitement to genocide is. And Agnes Calamar of, I think she's at Columbia right now, she sets out this hierarchy, and incitement to genocide being at the top, incitement to violence, then incitement to hatred, and then dissemination. So we're going to have to come to terms with the fact that there's going to be this whole section of hate speech, as we call it, at the bottom of this pyramid, that we should allow. And the last point I'd make is that we talk about what people can say online and offline. I'd say yes, we can talk about, people online can say things that they wouldn't say offline, and proximity and anonymity are factors in that. But I would make another point, which is that social media provides a reflection of what's happening in society. Just the fact that people can say what they can on social media, they don't outside, doesn't mean that it's not a valuable test for the health of our democracy and
Murtaza, thank you. Jason, bring you in here. You're on mute, sir.
Just building off those, not building off, but quick response as an American. It's really startling to hear Murtaza's comments, because I'm in the one liberal democracy with no hate speech regulation at all. So for all of you, it's quite normal to talk about different kinds of hate speech, but everything goes in the United States. And as a result, we don't even have the beginnings of a method to talk about this. And it worries me that some of these social media companies are located in the United States, in the one liberal democracy in the world that does not have, we have theorists who theorize about this when they're talking about the international space. But inside the United States, it's a unique free-for-all for speech. And that happens to be where Silicon Valley is located. So all those very important distinctions and classifications Murtaza's been making, the things we discussed in our seminar on language and power, because of the United States' stance, we can't.
And Jason, let's go one step further. And I want to go to Imran here, because I think we've heard the word open society, democracy thus far. And I want to put this out there in terms of, Imran, you all know we've had the Russia report come out in the UK. We've heard about the potential and the likelihood of interference in our democratic systems. How do you work with companies that have multi-jurisdictions, who are interested in profit, and therefore they will be in different countries? But then when you talk about values and protected characteristics, how do we engage with countries that might be co-opting those same platforms to undermine us? How should companies even start approaching issues such as those? Sorry, easy question for you, sir.
Well, yeah, I don't think we can. I mean, I think Web 2.0, this experiment in amplifying, so I'm just going to very quickly read from a 2018 internal presentation at Facebook. The Wall Street Journal exposed this a few months ago. Our algorithms exploit the human brain's attraction to divisiveness. If left unchecked, more and more divisive content, Facebook will feed users more and more divisive content in an effort to gain user attention and increase time on the platform. That's their own internal assessment of their own platform. The experiment was not about freedom of speech. It was about creating an attention economy that allowed them to sell advertising. 98% of Facebook's revenues, one of the wealthiest companies in the world, comes from advertising. We are not the customers of Facebook or Google or Twitter. We are their product. Our speech, our opinions, our feelings, our sentiments are packaged and sold to advertisers. And not just that, but access to us contextually. And in a way in which our barriers aren't up. The information is sent to us at the same time as we're cooing over pictures of our friends' babies. And I don't have any children, so my cat, which is a very cute cat, and it is a devastatingly effective platform for selling advertising.
But Imran, let me ask you, and this is a question I'll ask Priscilla next. Forgive me, Imran, which is a question around, and Malcolm has asked this question, who has the ascendancy in deciding rules for moderating platforms? Should it be corporations, or do we need government intervention and heavy regulation?
Well, we've already seen it with things like Stop Hate for Profit and projects like Stop Funding Fake News. This is negotiated by society. And you know, I'm pretty ruthless about these things. I say, I know who Facebook listen to. They listen to advertisers. So I go straight to the advertisers. I show them their brand next to hate. And I say, are you sure you want that? And they very quickly say no. And they very quickly start saying they'll pull their advertising unless their brand, unless Ford or the Oxford University is not next to a headline saying, Black people are subhuman. So, I mean, it's very simple from my perspective. I know what the levers to pull are. And we're quite ruthless about doing it because, as I say, I'm not a philosopher. I'm a disruptive activist. But that, I mean, if you want to look at it at a bigger level, yes, you're right. Society negotiates the rules, the terms of trade upon which we speak to each other and on which we conduct our society. There is somewhere in between the Hobbesian state of nature and the tyranny of the state deciding everything that we say. And actually, you know, there are all sorts of philosophical approaches that we can use, that we can cherry pick from ideas. But in the end, it is a constant negotiation. The United States may have freedom of speech, but my God, even I get told I'm not allowed to call myself a certain term, like colored person or Asian or whatever else, because it's not PC. And I'm like, jeepers, am I being racist against myself? So this is these are constantly negotiated aspects of our society. What is acceptable, what isn't, what terminology is.
Imran, thank you.
Companies have done nothing.
Thank you. Priscilla, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what's been said so far, especially given, you know, the context in which you're in Mexico, and whether in terms of regulation, or do we allow society to be able to govern itself in the way Imran has articulated? Is that possible? Does it work in the same way? Would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, we have seen, like, especially in Mexico and Central America, that there is direct intervention of states regulation. So they are the ones also that are having this conversation with platforms, especially to define some kind of concepts that they have been working on hate speech. And what they are trying to do is put it in the norms, on the community standards, and also in other kinds of terms. This is very this is an alert, because, as you may know, many of the countries in Central America and also in Latin America in general have been through dictators, and that has been like a really problem, because now many of the governments are trying to find these alliances with platforms or with the intermediates to try to limit or inhibit freedom of expression. So that has been a really really great problem in Latin America, and especially because also many of the content moderation, as I was telling you before, are from other kinds, are in Silicon Valley. You know, it's that they don't know any of the context that we are living. They don't know how the governments are also trying to inhibit freedom of expression or another rights, and they don't know the past, the history of that country that is trying to find this way in these platforms also to express themselves, to also to see how the government is being punishing other groups, how online violence is being also issued, or many other kinds of topics are being arised in Latin America. So for us, it is essential, this internet, these platforms, we're trying to conserve, we're trying not to regulate the internet, because what we have seen is that the governments are like trying to make these bills that are completely against freedom of expression and access information. So for us, it is very difficult to fight these kinds of bills. And it is basically like, I think like many of the congressmen, like for example in Mexico, see that they copy and paste the laws of the US without knowing exactly what is happening now. So it is very risky on that.
Priscilla, thank you so much. I don't know how we've done it. We're conscious of time. It's an hour. It was never going to be enough. Murtaza, I'm coming to everybody, don't worry. I'm going to go around everybody to give you an opportunity for reflections and summary. But I wanted to also ask you one question. As a Good Society Forum, we are grounded in practice and sharing with the world, because I think this is a conversation happening all over the place, in every quarter of what we've heard in terms of our guests and people who will listen in afterwards. Could you give an example as we go around, an example of somewhere that is, or a practice, an entity, a country who's doing well in terms of a balance between battling free speech and combating hate and good speech, however you want to frame it? I'd love to hear good practice. Feel free to blow your own trumpet. Also, that also works. Murtaza, if I could start with you maybe, and feel free to offer any reflections on what you've heard so far. You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, I'll just combine my thoughts on what Priscilla was saying and the final thoughts that you said. And I'd say the question of regulation is who is doing it and who should be doing it. Who is doing it? The answer, everyone. It's happening at the European level, it's happening at the state level. The UK is going to publish an online harms bill in December, where it's going to propose Ofcom to be the regulator for video content, or maybe all online content. The Oversight Board is an experiment by Facebook. Other social media companies will probably follow. TikTok has something in the pipeline. The UN is trying to do it. So everyone is trying to do it. Who should be doing it? Well, the solution can only really be, given the nature of the issue, it can only really be a multilateral international effort that can regulate this, because it's a multilateral international issue. You can't do it on state level. So in the sense of what will work and what can work, obviously I will echo what Priscilla said, that we have to resort to the human rights framework, because it's dealt with these issues already in the real world. So we have to try to apply them to the offline and virtual world. And the example of where that's happening, the Oversight Board is an incredible experiment that, if successful, will fulfill what you're trying to say. But we have to wait and see how it deals with the many challenges it has with selecting cases, how it deliberates. And the second thing I'd say, David Kay has done monumental work in this field, and his reports and his work, they provide a framework of how to apply freedom of expression and the prevention of hate speech to this very specific context of online social media platforms. So those are the two places we should be looking.
Murtaza, thank you. Jason. Oh, hold on, you're on mute again. No.
I only ever raise worries. One day I will move to solutions, but it worried me when Murtaza said we need an international framework, because we're seeing all over these multinational corporations that do not want international regulations pair up with the ultra-nationalists and the proto-fascists the Boris Johnsons, the Donald Trumps, the Bolsonaros, the Modis, who are anti-international frameworks. And so that's my concern, that we have got, you know, the international frameworks are essential, but that's just going to send the tech titans into more White House dinners with Peter Thiel and Donald Trump.
Thank you, Jason. And Priscilla.
Yes, I just want to say that internet is not the cause of all the problems. I think it's the society, or what you can see in internet is a reflection of a society that has been always reproducing hate speech. It's not only like in the 10 or 15 years ago, it has been always. So we have to really be conscious on what we are doing to prevent, to eradicate hate speech. If we are also seeking to dialogue with parts, seeing the different perspectives of the groups, what does the government with public policy have been doing? No, because it is really, you can see that nothing is being done by the government. No, they just do this public policy things, but nothing works. So we have to really like analyze and see what and where are we standing, and what can be done by society today, not by the platforms, because the only ones that have the decisions is society, not the big companies.
Priscilla, thank you. And Imran, I'm sure you're aware, my local team, West Ham, are beating your local team at the moment. But with that in mind, your last thoughts?
Well, I'm glad we do have social mores, because I'd have some choice words for you right now. Maybe I should go online and say them. I think if you want the countries that I think are interesting, and so I'm going to point out two specific examples that I think are interesting. One is Germany. So Germany outlawed Holocaust denial online, and you know what? It disappeared. Facebook took it all down, because they can. They just choose not to in other countries. And in fact, what they say to us, they obfuscate. They say, well, make it illegal. They're literally daring regulators. I've sat there with the Holocaust Educational Trust and Facebook's representatives saying, make it illegal, and then we won't have it on our site. So they can, but they choose not to. It's a will to act question. It's not a capacity to act. The second is that I have a look at New Zealand. So I met David Shank, the chief censor of New Zealand, recently, and I admired him greatly because he's very open about what he is. He's a lawyer, but he's a censor, and he understands that word holds a squeamishness correctly for all liberal Democrats, that we don't like the idea of censorship. So there's no obfuscating around regulation or social mores or norms. We ban things. We say that some things are beyond the pale. So as an example, it was the manifesto of the murderer who murdered Muslims. I've forgotten the chap's name because, of course, also Jacinda said that his name couldn't be repeated. And you'll sit there with counter-extremism and counter-terrorism professionals and people won't know his name because they just said, no, we don't want him being venerated. And actually, I think the maturity of that debate that they have in New Zealand over what should be acceptable, it's driven from the very core fact that they're open about what it is they're asking for. Censorship. We should be squeamish about it. Censorship's a dangerous thing in the hands of dictators. But then when it came to Myanmar, would it have been right for Facebook to censor the government's own propaganda, dehumanizing Muslims that led to a genocide? These are complex questions. They cannot be broken down into first-year PPE/SBS discussions of, freedom of speech versus, these are also about consequences in real lives, dead people. And that's why I think it's a fantastically fascinating debate. I'm so glad that we're having it. It will never end. We'll never get it right. But it's so great that you have this space available for us to have it today. And I'm really
Imran, and as a perfect point at which to say thank you, Imran, Priscilla, Jason, Murtaza. As you say, Imran, the Good Society Forum was created to build and continue to build the good society. It's an evolutionary process. It's iterative. We know it's going to continue. This conversation was never going to do this conversation or discussion topic justice, but I think you've made a brilliant start, and we look forward to continuing it. Emma, over to you.
So thank you, Niz. And I just want to echo your thanks to Murtaza, to Jason, Priscilla, and Imran. That was a really, really important and really great conversation. And thank you to our audience for joining in. And please join us again, same time next Wednesday, when we're going to be discussing God and the Good Society. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.